The defendant, John DeLee, was angry. He wanted a fight. He demanded a fight. And he wasn't leaving that night until he got it. He demanded a fight inside the bar, telling Timmy Pouliot, let's go outside. Let's go outside. He demanded a fight as he was leaving the bar, yelling, come fucking fight me. Come fight me. Come fight me, as the bouncers were kicking him out. He demanded a fight out on the street, yelling back at the bar for someone to come outside and fight him. He demanded a fight further up the street when Timmy Pouliot's friend came over to talk, and the defendant struck him in the face, not once, but twice. And he demanded a fight when he squared off with Timmy in the middle of Old Granite Street, surrounded by both of their friends. The defendant was angry at Timmy Pouliot, and angry at Timmy's friends. He was looking to teach Timmy a lesson, but not with his fists. He was looking for a reason to use his gun. And he got exactly what he asked for, exactly what he wanted. As the bars were letting out for the night in Manchester in the early morning hours of January 28th, 2023, as the streets were filling with people leaving to go home, the defendant, John DeLee, opened fire on Timmy Pouliot in the middle of Old Granite Street. He shot 9 rounds directly at Timmy, striking him twice in the front, once in the side, and 5 times in the back, gunning him down in a street full of people, then turning and walking away. And he did this not out of fear, not out of necessity, but out of anger. This case is about rage, not fear. This case is about retribution, not protection. This case is about murder, not self-defense. Now let's back up for a moment and talk about what led up to the murder of Timmy Pouliot. This all began at the Goat Bar and Grill in Manchester, and you will see this location on your view tomorrow. The road in front of the Goat is called Old Granite Street. And this is an overview of that area with the Goat marked in red. Old Granite Street is a short street in downtown Manchester, and it contains several bars, including the Goat. It's a place where people gather to go out on the weekend, and on the night of Friday, January 27th, 2023, the defendant went to the Goat with his friends, Matthew Soldano and Gage Chandler. Now this is a floor plan of the interior of the Goat, and you will not be seeing the interior of the Goat during your view, but you will be seeing this diagram during trial. So I want to take a moment just to go over it with you. So this red line on the right side of the screen shows you where Old Granite Street is. That's the front of the building. That box shows you the main entrance where patrons come into the bar, get checked in, and then start proceeding in. There's a main bar entrance that you'll be hearing about, or main bar section. There's a dance floor in front of a shaded area, which is the stage that had live music. And there's a ramp area that you will hear people refer to that's right next to the dance floor. Those are the main areas that you'll be hearing about during the trial. There are also several, as you can see, smaller bars and seating areas throughout the Goat. Now the interior of the Goat contains several surveillance cameras, and you'll be seeing footage from 3 different angles. In red, something called the pool table cam, which shows you the ramp and the dance floor area. In green, there's a camera called the main and sidebar 2, which shows you the main bar and the ramp. And in blue, the main bar window, which shows you the main bar and the exit going back out of the Goat. Now on this surveillance video, you will see the defendant and his two friends, Gage Chandler and Matthew Soldano. And as you can see from these stills that were taken from the surveillance photo, the defendant was wearing a gray knit hat that night and a black North Face sweatshirt. Gage Chandler, over to the left, was wearing a tan zip pullover, and Matthew Soldano was wearing a gray knit hat and a blue long sleeve shirt. Now, the defendant and his friends went to the GOAT on the night of Friday, January 27th, 2023. And while they were there, the defendant's ex-girlfriend, Abby Elliott Orr, arrived with two of her friends, Nicole Bergeron and Olivia Leonardo. Now, the defendant and Abby had dated the summer before, and though they had broken up, he was still obsessed with her. When Abby and her friends arrived at the GOAT, they went to the dance floor, where Timothy Pouliot and his friends began talking with them. You will also see Timmy and his friends in the surveillance video, and again, these are stills taken from that footage that you will see during trial. Timmy on the top is the one with the curly blonde hair, and he's wearing a black sweater and a necklace. His friend Trenton Nash is to the left, wearing a white baseball cap and a black jacket, and his friend Michael Mendoza is to the right, wearing a white and black sweater. This is a still from surveillance video showing the dance floor and ramp area that I was talking about at the GOAT. In that yellow box, you can see Timmy with the blonde hair, Trenton Nash, the back of his head with the white baseball cap, and Michael Mendoza. And you can see them starting to talk to Abby and her two friends, Nicole and Olivia. And in the background, in that red box, you can see the defendant watching them. Now, as soon as the defendant saw Timmy talking with his ex-girlfriend, he went over, and he started to escalate things. Now, the defendant had never met Timmy before that night, but he made his presence known now. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask how they were doing. He walked up to the group and asked Abby and her friends what they were doing with this scum. Now, Timmy was 5 foot 7 inches and 121 pounds. And Timmy was not armed. The defendant was almost a foot taller and about 200 pounds heavier than Timmy, with a handgun hidden in his waistband. Now, Timmy laughed off the defendant's name calling at first, and then he told Abby and her friends to be safe and to enjoy their night. And he politely left the group. Timmy even spoke to the defendant and shook his hand before going on his way. After a little while, Abby and her friends left the defendant, still over there on the dance floor in that red box, and went up to the bar that you can see in the yellow box area. Timmy and Michael Mendoza were at the bar, and they thought they might still have a shot, so they offered to buy Nicole a drink. And with the defendant still down by the dance floor and safely out of earshot, they talked tough to Abby and her friends. They said that they wanted to fight the defendant. They said that they were pro-fighters. And Timmy told the women that he thought he could take the defendant. 5'7", 121-pound Timothy Pouliot told Abby and her friends that he thought he could take the defendant. Now, as soon as Abby and her friends walked back over to where the defendant was, Abby told the defendant that Timmy and his friends had said they wanted to knock him out and that they were pro-fighters. You will hear that when Abby told the defendant that Timmy had dared to say he could beat him up, the defendant didn't go to a bouncer for help. He didn't grab his friends and say, "It's time for us to leave." He didn't try to de-escalate the situation in any way because he wasn't scared. He wasn't in fear. But he was angry, really angry. He stared at Timmy, still sitting at the bar, now talking to an acquaintance named Isla Baramovich. And the defendant watched him. And then he confronted him. With the defendant's friend, Gage Chandler, watching behind him in that yellow box. The defendant towered over Timmy's back, and he repeatedly and aggressively challenged Timmy to go outside. Timmy kept saying no, he wouldn't go outside, but the defendant kept challenging him. And Isla will tell you that she knew the defendant was a threat, and you will see in the surveillance footage that she was so intimidated by the defendant's size and aggression that she left to get a bouncer for help. But before she could, the defendant escalated from words to physical violence. He shoved Timmy, and he shoved him hard enough that Timmy slid to the left up against another person at the bar. He shoved him hard enough that it caught the attention of Brian Delaney in the blue box there, the bouncer at the other end of the bar. And Brian and other bouncers jumped in and pulled the defendant away from Timmy. Now, this is part of surveillance footage that you'll see during the trial. We're now looking at it from a different angle, and you can see the defendant's back. Here, there's his hat and his friend, Gage, standing off to the left. Timmy's blocked by the defendant. He's in front of him still at the bar. Now, after the defendant shoved Timmy there, he didn't ask those bouncers that came over for help. He didn't say that he shoved him because he was afraid of Timmy. Instead, when Brian Delaney asked the defendant why he was starting something with such a little kid, the defendant laughed and said that Timmy had called him a bitch. Then the defendant went back down to the ramp near the dance floor to stand with Abby and their friends. Now, Timmy's friends, Michael Mendoza and Trenton Nash, were standing in that same area, and you can see the top of their heads there in that yellow box. You will see that after the defendant assaulted Timmy at the bar, Timmy walked down the ramp and whispered something to Michael. Within seconds, Michael walked over to the defendant and took a swing at him. The defendant grabbed Michael and threw him to the ground, knocking them both into the bar in the process. Now, bouncers from the GOAT immediately jumped in to break up the fight, and along with Manchester police officer Eric Smith, they kicked out Michael Mendoza, and they kicked out the defendant, who was bleeding on the left side of his face from the altercation. During the trial, you will see and you'll be able to hear footage of the defendant being kicked out of the GOAT. That was taken by actually a cell phone video from someone in the bar. And you will see the defendant here, as well as Timmy in the background, and Abby, and the bouncers around him. This is the edge of Officer Smith, who you'll see in the video. You will see and hear the defendant's emotions. He was in a rage. He was swearing. He was yelling. But he wasn't yelling that he was afraid of Timmy, or that he was afraid of Timmy's friends. He wasn't yelling for someone to come help him. He was yelling for someone to come fight him. He was yelling, "Who just punched me in the face? Come fucking fight me. Come fight me. Come fight me." No fear, no terror, just anger. He wanted to finish the fight. He was demanding to finish the fight. You will see surveillance from outside the GOAT after the defendant and Michael Mendoza were kicked out. Now, Michael was the first one to leave the bar with Trenton Nash, and they're highlighted there in that yellow circle. And when they left, they walked across Old Granite Street and got into their car. The white car parked here. Shortly afterwards, the defendant was kicked out. He didn't go straight to his car. He didn't ask for help from a bouncer or from Officer Smith, who was in the goat. He didn't quietly walk his separate way. Instead, he stayed on the sidewalk outside the goat, surrounded by his friends, with his arms raised, continuing to swear and yell and challenge someone to come fight him. Yelling, "Who punched me? What's up? Who punched me? What's up?" This is a clip of the surveillance footage that you will see at trial capturing those moments as the defendant leaves the goat, followed up the street by Abby and her friends as he repeatedly screamed, "Who punched me? What's up?" Still angry, still looking for a fight. Now, Timmy also left the goat after the defendant and Michael were kicked out. He wasn't yelling or swearing. He didn't leave angry. He walked out calmly, and he turned left and started walking the opposite direction from the defendant and his friends down Old Granite Street. Now, at this point, Michael Mendoza and Trenton Nash were in their car. Timmy was walking away. This should have been the end of the confrontation. But the defendant wasn't done. He still wanted to fight. Now we're looking at a screenshot from surveillance video from the other direction. So we're looking back down towards the goat. Timmy's gone off the screen to this direction. The red box shows you the defendant who's standing there with with Matthew Soldano, with Gage Chandler, with Abby and her friends, all in that group. And Michael Mendoza and Trenton Nash are still in this car. Matt, Gage, Abby, Olivia, Nicole were all trying to calm down the defendant at that point, but they couldn't. He kept getting more and more aggravated. And you will hear, as you could hear on that last surveillance video, how he continued to scream and yell at a street full of people leaving the bars, yelling derogatory words and insults. At this point, Trenton Nash got out of the car and walked across the street and started talking to the defendant and his group of friends. But the defendant didn't want a conversation. He wanted a fight. So he assaulted Trenton, striking him in the head, not once, but twice. You can see Trenton at the beginning of this clip of the video, right here, with the white hat, and he's smoking, and he's walking over towards the defendant and his friends. At this point, when the defendant hit Trenton, Michael Mendoza got out of the car and came over from where he had been sitting in the driver's seat. He pulled out pepper spray and he pointed it at the defendant to get him to back down. The defendant pulled a handgun out of his waistband, dropped it on the sidewalk, picked it back up, and racked it. Abby screamed at the defendant to put the gun away. And at this point, his friends finally managed to push him up the street, away from the goat, and away from Michael and Trenton. Now, Timmy was not there when the defendant struck Trenton. He was still back down the street. But you will see on video footage where he stopped and started looking back up towards the street, toward the confrontation that was being caused by the defendant, before eventually walking back up Old Granite Street. You will also be able to see in this footage the defendant's friend Matt Soldano clearly trying to calm the defendant down as they went up the street, trying to get him to listen and trying to get him to leave. Now the defendant, Matt, and Gage, his friends, went up the sidewalk in the direction of that red arrow. Past Soho Bistro, which was another bar marked in the orange, which was also letting out at that time. Patrons were leaving at the end of the night. Michael Mendoza and Trenton Nash walked up the street but turned to their left as marked by that blue path and went into the Bank of America parking lot, which was on the opposite side of the street. Now, at this point, the defendant's path to his car, his transportation home, was clear. Right down that alley to the left-hand side of Soho, back to the Market Basket parking lot where his car was parked. Now, you may hear a claim that this alley didn't seem safe to the defendant and to his friends. Pay close attention to the video surveillance when you watch it at trial, and you will see that the defendant's friend Matt tried to get him to go this way. This was the path straight to their car. There was no one in their way. At this point, there was no one following them. Timmy was still down the street. Michael and Trenton were in the Bank of America parking lot on the other direction. That was the way home. But the defendant didn't want to go home because he wasn't done. He was still angry, and he wanted to finish the fight. He wanted to use his gun. You will see on this video how after starting to follow his friend Matt's direction and walking towards his car, the defendant turned and came back towards Old Granite Street, ignoring Matt's attempts to stop him. And you will see that Matt yelled at him, he pushed on him, he pointed down that alley trying to get the defendant to disengage, but nothing worked. The defendant was angry and he didn't want to leave. He wanted to fight. So he went past Matt back onto Old Granite Street. This is the video from the defendant in the alley. The defendant pushed past Matt right to this intersection, marked in red, to square off with Timmy. He didn't go down to the alley to his car so he could leave. He didn't take a right towards the snooze center in downtown Manchester to just leave the area. He didn't walk into Soho, which was open right there in the corner, or back to the Goat, which were full of people. He didn't yell out to security or to anyone else for help. He didn't use his cell phone to call 911. Instead, the defendant chose to walk straight out onto Old Granite Street and square up with Timmy and his friends. And let's be clear, you will see that this was not 1 against 3. Matt Soldano was standing right here next to the defendant. The defendant's friend Gage Chandler was right off to the corner over here. This is Timmy and Michael Mendoza and Trent Nash. And as they stood there, surrounded by people, leaving the bars, as they faced off and argued back and forth in the street, Timmy gave the defendant the excuse he'd been looking for all night. Timmy reached up and punched the defendant in the face. The defendant immediately ripped the gun from his pocket and started pulling the trigger, without hesitation. He pulled his handgun out for the final time that night and shot 9 times, straight at Timothy Pouliot. And he was so close to Timmy and so focused on pumping those bullets into him that he hit Timmy 8 times. Continuing to shoot, even though Timmy started to turn and fall away to the ground after the first gunshot. The defendant kept shooting after Timmy's back was to him. He kept shooting all the time that Timmy was falling to the ground, his body full of bullets. 2 of those bullets in his front, 1 in his hand, and 5 in his back. 5 shots in Timmy's back, because this wasn't about fear. This wasn't about a threat. This was anger. After the defendant pulled his trigger 9 times, he briefly watched Timmy's body on the ground. Then he turned his back on Timmy, turned his back on Timmy's friends, and simply walked away, leaving Timmy to bleed out and die on the pavement. Now let's be clear, the shooting happened very fast. And it happened that fast because the defendant pulled the trigger that fast. So fast that no one on that street had time to process what he was doing. No one had time to stop him. The most that Timmy could do was turn away. But that didn't stop the defendant. He continued to pull that trigger even after the first shot. When Timmy started falling, the defendant kept shooting in spite of the people in the streets, in spite of the cars in the streets. He opened fire close enough that people ran for cover, close enough that Isla, who had just pulled onto Old Granite Street with a car full of her friends, felt the concussion from the force of the bullets on the roof of her car. Not only did the defendant murder Timmy, he endangered the lives of all those people on the street that night. Now, there will be no question in this case that the defendant pulled out a gun and shot Timothy Pouliot, causing his death. The question for you will be, do you believe his claim that he acted in self-defense?
Overruled.
You will receive detailed instructions from the judge on self-defense at the end of this trial. For now, I'm just going to quickly talk to you about 2 requirements for self-defense to keep in mind when you are seeing and hearing the evidence in this case. The defendant is only allowed to use deadly force to defend himself if he actually believed Timmy was about to use deadly force against him, and if that belief was reasonable. You are going to see a lot of evidence that was caught on video. You will be able to see almost all of the events that I have described for you as they played out that night. You will see people's actions. You will see their reactions on their faces and in their body language. You will see people's emotions as the night played out. Watch the defendant. Watch his facial expressions. Watch his body language. Listen to his words and his tone of voice. You will see anger. You will see someone looking for a fight. You will see all the other options the defendant had that night other than shooting his gun. What you are not going to see at any time from the defendant is fear. You will not see fear of Timmy. You will not see fear of Timmy's friends. You will not see actual fear at any time throughout the night. And you will not see a reason for fear because there was none. The defendant's friends were next to him. Timmy and his friends were unarmed. Timmy was almost a foot shorter than the defendant and about 200 pounds lighter than the defendant. A punch from Timothy Pouliot to the defendant was not deadly force. Instead of fear, you will see that the defendant initiated and escalated at every stage of the night. He confronted Timmy when he was talking to Abby on the dance floor. He shoved Timmy when he was sitting at the bar with Isla. When the defendant was kicked out of the bar, he was yelling for someone to come fight him. He punched Trent Nash twice on the street. He was consistently the aggressor, and he had a safe way to leave the confrontation he had started, right down the alley that Matt Soldano was trying to get him to go down. But instead, he turned and he came back, still looking for a fight. The law doesn't allow a person to instigate and escalate and demand a fight and then claim self-defense when someone punches him. When the defendant was arrested by police just after he shot Timmy, he knew he was caught, he knew he was in trouble, and he tried to convince them that he acted in self-defense. And you will hear that he claimed things that the video footage will show you just are not true, like that it was 3 against 1, even though his friends were right there. But those self-serving statements can't erase his behavior up until this point, and they won't erase what you can see for yourself on the video. The other thing to keep in mind as you're hearing the evidence is that a person's not permitted to use excessive force in self-defense, only a reasonable amount of force. The defendant shot at Timothy Pouliot 9 times. 5 of those shots were in his back. And each of those shots was a choice by the defendant to pull the trigger. You will see that every shot after the first one was after Timmy was turning away and falling to the ground. That is not reasonable. That is not proportional. That is excessive by any definition. In a moment, defense counsel will have a chance to speak with you as I have. They may raise issues with you that I've not discussed in the opening, but which will be addressed during trial. I ask you to keep an open mind and wait to hear all of the evidence, see all of the video footage before you make up your mind. The shooting in this case was captured on a bystander's cell phone. This is a still image of the last moments that Timothy Pouliot was alive. Right after he dared to square off with the defendant, dared to punch the defendant. Of all the options available to the defendant that night, he chose the most extreme reaction, he chose the most deadly, and he chose the most permanent.
Dude, these guys are all talking. Oh.
Get the fuck back. Hey, get back here, back here.
That is not self-defense. That is rage and retribution and anger. And that is why at the close of this case, we will ask you to find the defendant guilty of endangering all the people on Old Granite Street that night and of murdering Timothy Pouliot.